heard people say that they spend weeks or even months prepping a game, and maybe it's just me, but that sounds like an uncomfortably long time. Like, why do that? Using the same methods that I'm about to teach, I build a sandbox in just like 1 or 2 days or even faster. So building can be quick. However, that doesn't mean that the process lacks complexity, because a good sandbox
is like an enormous clock.
Yes, precisely. It only works if all the little cogs mesh together.
And today we'll define the 2 most important cogs needed to run our game with mechanical precision, and that starts with our foundation, which I call the terrible 2, because these are the 2 most vital parts of building your sandbox for any TTRPG, but are simultaneously the 2 least interesting things to figure out about any sandbox. I'd rather be figuring out monsters or dungeons or cool powers or villains, yet I can't really do any of that before I work out these 2 points, because literally everything else in my world will be hinged upon these 2 things. These 2 things will also, funnily enough, never be changed by the players, or maybe not even interacted with at all, but are still so vital to making sure that your game runs smoothly. And like eating our broccoli before having our ice cream, so too do we need to start with the not so fun bits. Otherwise, we run the risk of spoiling ourselves for the intentional work that this part of the world building can be. And that's not to say that it can't be fun, but it usually isn't, or at least not for me, and maybe not for you either. But it's important to figure out these things first and build on top of them, because if you don't, I promise you that you will find yourself in deep shit later on. And possibly the most important thing is what we're going to start with first, and that is your government. How are the people in your sandbox, in your setting, governing themselves? The DMG does have a useful chart on different government types, but really, you just have to know the power dynamic in your setting. Who's the boss? Not necessarily who's the main villain, but who's typically in charge of the government? How are they elected? Who chooses them? How do they stay in power? If you want your setting to feel more grounded, then you have to figure this out. And I would start by seeing what interesting governmental structures have actually existed throughout human history. And then just find one you like and copy that, including, though, the atrocities that society that you're copying committed, because you will be flabbergasted at some of the terrible things that humans have gotten up to in history, and they are all excellent fodder for different quests that your party might go on. Government is also vital because literally everything is going to be determined by this. From the dawn of mankind, whenever a group of people gets together, whether that's 5 kids on a playground, 25 people stranded on an island, or 25 million people stranded on an island, the first thing that people are going to try to establish is who's boss, who's in charge, who's the leader. Government is so important, actually, that there's almost a million different ways to have government and only one way to not. And if you don't figure out this major point in your setting, then I assure you that this is surely what you will have. Sidebar. You may ask, well, earlier you said these things aren't going to be changed by the player's actions, but you said government. You know, like, why can't this change? What if a PC wants to become a king or a queen? God, what if I'm running a political campaign? Then what? My answer to that would be that small facets of your government may change. Like, who holds a certain position? But the governmental body itself is going to remain largely unchanged, because there are only 2 ways to change a government, right? From the inside or from the outside. If you're changing it from the outside, then that's going to mean, invasion, some kind of war or something. So perhaps your players are overthrowing some tyrant. That makes sense. Or maybe they want to change that government from the inside by becoming a king or by joining the government in some way. Well, firstly, I would say
only the feeblest of men take jobs in the government.
But secondly, I would say that both of these goals are campaign ending, meaning that once you accomplish them, that's going to be game over. Once you beat the tyrant king and overthrow them, or God forbid you become that tyrant king, then that's GG's all around. A good game, you win. Now you get to make the world as you see fit. You get to change the government. But very little of the minutiae of actually ruling a kingdom and restructuring it is going to be playable material. I mean, how many books about King Arthur, let's say, are about his courtly proceedings versus how many books are about his time in the field and all the different quests that him and his circle of knights go on? And I assure you that ruling at court is going to be even duller to play than it's going to be to read about. Government really is just part of your setting's backdrop. It isn't meant to be mutable during the story, and that's just a writing principle. But from a gameplay perspective, restructuring the government in your world will really just result in a lot of game master bookkeeping. There's going to be very little dice to roll, very little adventure to be had for the player during this time, which is why changing a major part of your backdrop in your world should happen after the campaign or in between two different campaigns. Then the player can tell you, after they've beaten the campaign and they've become the king, how they reshape the world under their rule. You can take all of the different changes that they would make in their world and their new country and inject that information into your next campaign, so that way when they're no longer in the castle and they have to go on their next quest, they can go into that next campaign with the world as they changed it. But that is not something that you're going to roll at the table during the campaign. During the campaign, your story should actually stray far away from any major events or missions that fundamentally change the structure or the power dynamic in your setting, because, well, I can tell you from experience that I did that. I had some crazy world-altering event happen, but then I had to figure out in the middle of the campaign how every single faction would move forward from there, every single major PC, because there's only so much that you can improvise, right, without contradictions. So I had to stop for a couple months just to restructure everything. And by the time I did that, I'm actually ashamed to say that basically my players lost interest in the campaign and they wanted to play other characters. And so all of that prep that I did actually ended up being time wasted. So I inadvertently kind of ruined my campaign by changing things so drastically in the middle of it. So pro tip, if you want to have a world altering event, you can, but save such events for the end of the campaign. Because if that world change happens, then guess what? You have to change the world. And that is always time consuming for the game master. Even if it's something that's fun and that you like to do and it's relatively quick, it's still gonna take time. So my advice is to save that for when all the chips are down. And speaking of chips, your world also cannot function. Even if it has a government, it cannot function without the economy. You cannot have a working sandbox without knowing how money is going to work in that setting. Does it rely on trade? Does it rely on barter? Does it rely on any kind of currency? And if so, what are the different values of those different types of currency and even services, if those can be rendered as a form of payment? Staying alive as an adventurer must be expensive work given all the weapons and the armor and the magic items that they go through. So players will always have one burning need.
We need money.
So you need to know how things can be bought, how things can be sold, and now it will be clear why it's so important to figure out our government, because what kind of governmental body is at play in your setting is going to heavily influence the type of economy that you have. You'll have to determine how different businesses are conducted. If your government is a tribal hunter-gatherer society like the Na'vi, then buying things with gold probably isn't going to make a lot of sense, in which case they might use barter instead. And in such a case, you may find that D&D's pricing charts don't really help you very much, because how many mangoes does one of this cost? I assure you, I do not know. So these kinds of problems have to be ironed out by either homebrewing or using third-party expansions, or by switching games altogether. If you don't figure out your economy and your government and you don't get that tight, you will regret it later, especially if you're doing a custom setting. But that's it. These are the terrible twos. These are the two structural points that you need to ponder, even though they're not really quite that fun to think about. Because knowing your government and knowing your economy is going to automatically answer a bunch of other world building questions that will come up. These two major points affect things like the value of education, for instance. How educated are people? And that's also going to determine just generally how easy information is to find or how easy it is to come by, which is also going to determine the commonness of things like medicine, surgery, higher art. Is there even access to things like poetry, theater? And more importantly, this is going to determine the availability of weapons, armor, and magic items. In terms of bare essentials, I found that no matter how much world building I do, my job is never done until I know these two things. These are the wooden borders that contain the sand in our sandbox. Now, realistically, fleshing out just these two things, fleshing out a government, making an economy, these are things that can take a writer decades to do, as Tolkien can attest. But for me, I just try to spend a couple days on it, taking notes throughout the day as I think of things. After I get this step done, then I find that everything else flows downhill from there. And it becomes way easier, way faster to build everything else, because everything else is going to build upon these two aspects. Now remember, we aren't writing a magnum opus. We're just prepping a game. And even though it can be work, it should never be toilsome. So don't spend too much time on this. Get these two done and you will be well on your way to establishing not only an excellent sandbox, but one that your players are going to be addicted to because it is going to feel so grounded and so realistic. But thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Please like, subscribe, and do consider joining our other 5 absolutely amazing patrons over on Patreon. Thank you all. You really do mean the world. I run D&D professionally almost daily on Start Playing Games. So if you would like to experience the depths, the true depths of what tabletop RPG can be, then do find me over there, and you can use the code on your screen now to receive a discount on your first few sessions with me. Other than that, I sincerely hope that this video helps you save some time, whatever stage of your world building that you're in. But be safe, look after yourselves and each other, and I'll see all of you in the next one.